Great. Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is the next session of our second forum day of Respectful Workplace Week 2024. And I'm just going to do a quick Zoom orientation for any of you that are just joining us. So as a reminder to everyone, if you're here as an attendee, your mic and camera are turned off and disabled. So you can contact us if you need to with any questions for the presenters or for the hosts today through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So we ask that we receive all of your questions and feedback that way, and we'll be monitoring those throughout the presentation, and we'll ask audience questions of the presenters at the end of their session. We have simultaneous translation available. So again, at the bottom of your screen, there's a drop-down menu where you can choose the language of your choice and have simultaneous interpretation ready for you throughout the remaining sessions. Quick reminder to the speakers today to try and go slowly so that the translators can keep up and have time to translate. Thank you so much for joining us here. Our next session is exploring the use of non-disclosure agreements in workplace harassment and abuse processes. This session is brought to us by Liz Leclerc and Kristen Feifeld from the organization Can't Buy My Silence. Liz Leclerc is proud to call herself a fundraiser and feminist. She brings more than 20 years of experience to her consulting work with Sugrasso Philanthropic CIC in Nova Scotia, Canada. Liz has served as a board member with local Association of Fundraising Professionals boards, was the past chair of the AFP Women's Impact Initiative and past co-chair of the AFP Fundraising Bill of Rights Task Force, and currently sits on the board of the African American Development Officer Network. In 2019, Liz published an op-ed with the Canadian Broadcasting Company, CBC, about her experience being sexually harassed and assaulted by high net worth donors. This advocacy work has evolved to include advocating for a more just and equitable sector. She continues to advocate for safe workplaces for fundraisers and nonprofit employees, and is a volunteer with Can't Buy My Silence's campaign to ban the misuse of non-disclosure agreements globally. Next, we have Christina Feifeld. Am I pronouncing your last name correct, Christina?
Fifield.
Fifield, thank you so much. Fifield is a feminist EMDR trauma therapist whose practice is grounded in a commitment to creating intentional space for healing, building on connectedness, trust, and safety. Relational values and ethics are at the heart of her practice, rooted in intersectional, equity-centered, trauma-informed, justice-doing, and community approaches to healing. Christina integrates gender-based justice doing work in her practice and was involved as a participant in the Nova Scotia public inquiry of April 2020, mass casualty events, and co-authored a report. She was appointed and now sits on the Gender-Based Violence and Advocacy seat for the Progress and Monitoring Committee. She is involved in working alongside survivors and the Can't Buy My Silence team to eliminate the misuse of NDAs, or non-disclosure agreements, in sexual violence, harassment, racism, bullying, and other human rights violation cases, and is involved on the advisory committee for the Leafs Accountability Project. Thank you so much, Liz and Christina, for joining us here today, and I will pass it along to you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Can you hear us clearly, or can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. All right, just making sure. I will apologize in advance to anyone on this call. I am doing this from home, and if the dogs decide they're going to bark, you're just going to all enjoy that background noise. So my apologies. The joys of working from home. Well, thank you very much for having us. Well, Alan, again, my name is Liz Leclerc, volunteer with the Can't Buy My Silence campaign, and both Christina and I are coming to you today from Nova Scotia, in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral territories of the Mi'kma'ki people. I am located in Dartmouth. Christina is located, I believe, somewhere in Bedford. Not sure a geographic location necessarily matters, but here we are. And thank you for allowing us to be here today. We really appreciate the ability to participate in the session. So very go with the flow. If people have questions, feel free. to ask them during the middle of the presentation, we can certainly try to answer them on the fly, but acutely aware that we have a short amount of time. We've tried to condense this presentation as much as possible to leave as much time as possible for Q&A at the end. So we'll just dive right into it. Or Christina, did you want to add anything to start?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so the Can't Buy My Silence campaign, we were co-founded in 2021 by Dr. Julie McFarlane, who is a law professor based out of Ontario, a longtime advocate and involved in justice and equity issues for quite a long time in Canada and the UK and Ireland, and Zelda Perkins, who was the first woman to break her non-disclosure agreement with Harvey Weinstein, who's based in the London area in UK. And they came together because both Julie and Zelda had very prolific experiences with abuse in the workplace, the use of NDAs, and they wanted to ensure that they could bring regulatory change and cultural change around the abuse of NDAs in cases of discrimination, abuse, harassment, and other forms of workplace abuse. The four main goals of our campaign is to lobby governments and advocate on behalf of survivors and victims around what the issues are in the abuse of NDAs, to raise public awareness like we are today, to create some kinds of code of practice, or at least or build some standards around how to be able to see where NDAs are being abused and how we create practices within workplaces, organizations, et cetera, communities, to create safer workplaces. And also the website and the organization are creating a safe platform for people to come forward and provide their testimony about how NDAs have affected them and impacted them in their lives. So what are non-disclosure agreements? In case anyone on the call is not familiar, the standard sort of definition of an NDA or a non-disclosure agreement is a contractual agreement in which the parties make a mutual agreement not to disclose material or knowledge designated as confidential to third parties. So the origins of NDAs actually started, we believe, well, really the proliferation of them was in the 1990s, 80s, 90s in the Silicon boom, tech sector. A lot of people were jumping back and forth between tech companies and the proprietary information. They wanted to be able to protect it. So this non-disclosure agreement started to be embedded in employment contracts in a lot of the tech sector and sort of proliferated out to the rest of the world. And as Julie would tell you if she was on this call, lawyers love templates. They love embedding templates into agreements and contracts because it makes their life easier. And the problem is that NDAs had such a broad sort of definition around material or knowledge designated as confidential. As you can imagine, we're talking about workplace safety. What does that actually mean? And it started to become very problematic, as we'll discuss. Christina will talk more about it from her perspective as a trauma counselor and therapist. But what are the impacts this has in workplace discrimination and abuse, and how these have been used to cover up that kind of thing over a period of time. We will talk a little bit more about how common they are, but it's a legal tool that was meant to protect intellectual property that now has grown into this massive way of covering up abuse in the workplace. And we're working to try not to ban NDAs altogether, but to bring them back to their original purpose, which is intellectual property, and keep it there. So essentially, that's the gist of the campaign. The essential elements of an NDA are that there's financial compensation tied to some kind of silence. So essentially, when you're signing some kind of settlement, and I'm not sure about the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission, but here in Nova Scotia, the Human Rights Commission Clause 11 of their settlement template includes an NDA. We have been trying to work to have them to remove that or adjust the wording around it. Essentially, that's how I came to understand NDAs existed here in Nova Scotia in this sense, was when I filed a complaint around harassment and abuse that I received in the workplace. Upon being offered a preliminary settlement, I realized there was an NDA tied to the compensation agreement, and I declined. Fortunately, it was around the same time of the Me Too movement, and I was well enough aware from what I was reading and from Zelda's story that this was a very dangerous thing for me to do, that I would limit my ability to speak to anyone other than a lawyer or a financial advisor. They're often permanent. There really is no timeline set on a lot of NDAs, or they have been permanent for quite a long time. So, someone can sign an agreement and basically for life, you're never allowed to have a conversation again about what's happened to you without technically breaking the contractual agreement that you may or may not have known that you were signing. The confidentiality can also be tied to your successors, i.e., your children. It can come, sometimes parents have been limited by their ability to speak about what's happened because of NDAs that tie them into it. It's can be very prohibitive in the sense that it's trying to be a reputational protection for either an organization or an individual, and it's basically lifetimes of families and other members are tied into this contractual agreement. Breaking an NDA can equal a contract breach, but as Christina can probably talk a little bit more about, the majority of people who sign them don't actually even realize they've signed them and don't know what the consequences are because we're talking about a lot of legal jargon. The majority of people that end up signing them have no background in law, no understanding of what they're signing, and they're worded in such a way that it's very difficult to understand what you've actually agreed to. So. Um, NDAs are often made between employers and the employee or a perpetrator in a complicit bargain to cover up wrongdoing. I'm not sure how many people on this call would be familiar with the case with University of Prince Edward Island, the former president there. We actually are connected to Wendy Carroll and Aaron Casey, who both were released from their NDA from UPEI to be able to talk about their experience. And often, organizations will sign these NDAs and then tie the entire organization. Also, anyone working at the organization is then tied to this NDA. Another example would be Dr. Julie McFarland herself. The NDA she found herself in was that there was a law professor that was booted out of the University of Windsor. He went on to try and apply for another job. Some called for a reference call. She told the reference that he was dangerous and had been harassing students. She technically broke the NDA that he had in the settlement agreement with the university, and he sued her as a part of that case, which is why she's been involved in this campaign to sort of reduce this. So where an employee is being terminated, an employer can sometimes make a monetary settlement, including an NDA. There's usually an alignment of interests around secrecy. It's beneficial for both the organization and the individual who's the perpetrator, but definitely not the victim. And we often call this pass the trash, right? So organizations will have someone sign an NDA, they'll have all of this happen, and basically they get the individual who's problematic to move to another organization. Meanwhile, the person who's been harmed is left behind to have to deal with the consequences of the unresolved issue or unresolved trauma of the experience that they've had. Victims are rarely involved sometimes in the actual negotiations of these NDAs, as we discussed with a few of these cases. So certainly like NDAs are being used as contractual between whoever the perpetrator is, the problematic employee, problematic owner, problematic board member, etc., and whoever's been harmed. Okay. I am hoping this is going to work. We have a short video called The Empty Chair, and it's excerpts from testimonies by people who have signed NDAs. If you can let me know if the audio isn't playing, I can restart it. So I'm just going to try here and we'll give it a go. No audio? Okay, hang
No,
on.
I don't hear any audio. I think when you share your screen, you have to choose the audio sharing
Right.
option. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. You think after this many years of doing Zoom calls, I'd have it down, but okay, we're gonna try it again. Is
There
that
we go.
working?
I can hear.
This
Yeah.
whole process was horrific. I had already gone
Oh, sorry.
a year before signing the NDA and had refused to sign. The second time I went, I had no support, no legal representation, and faced an adjudicator who made disparaging comments about my motivation and pressured me to sign.
The company, the union, and I met for what I thought was arbitration, but when we gathered, the arbitration never started. I said no to mediation and no to an NDA for more than 8 hours. After 9.5 hours, I was broken. I wanted to go home. I was hungry. I was tired. I was traumatized. So I signed the NDA.
I agreed to hide a part of myself that needs to be healed. I live small because I feel I am not worth justice.
I was not given any time to negotiate the NDA. My PTSD became worse. I experienced anxiety and made 2 suicide attempts. I never returned to full-time employment, and my 10-plus year career as a skilled tradeswoman ended.
I tried to break my way out of the NDA. I thought if I break it before I'm even given any money, then I just won't receive the money, and that will be that. I didn't care about the money, but the NDA made me feel dirty and gross. The day the NDA was foisted on me, it felt like non-consensual sex. It felt like an assault. I felt violated. I felt like the NDA covered me in filth, and I wanted desperately to get it off of me.
Why does the legal system and many of our institutions continue to be so ignorant? The answer is simple. It's because they continue to protect abusers. I don't need to prove abusers are protected. In fact, I have physical evidence in the form of my non-disclosure agreement from 1997. A quarter century later, I still can't speak a great deal of truth about my own childhood.
As a Black woman, I had relinquished the right to speak my truth, to reach out to and support other Black employees who were experiencing the same racist treatment that I faced. After I signed the NDA, I overdosed. After that, the world felt like a darker and more cynical place.
I refused the settlement offer and insisted on going to arbitration. Partway through that process, and more than a year after my termination, I was again offered an agreement which I insisted I did not want for fear of the consequences. The agreement included an NDA and financial compensation. Over several weeks, my union rep and their lawyer repeatedly pressured me to accept and sign that agreement, suggesting the grievances could be withdrawn if I didn't. The lawyers and the union rep controlled the entire thing.
From my perspective, it was a tactic to get me to quit. I regret not seeking legal advice earlier. I was on the brink of an emotional breakdown, and I knew I had to get my life back on track. I gave in and signed the NDA. Looking back, I regret it. I wasn't in the proper state of mind to make such an important decision.
The next day, I asked to be released. I said they knew I didn't want an NDA, that I had said no enough times, and that I was pressured into signing it. I was not released.
I was asked to sign an NDA to settle a sexual harassment complaint in my workplace. I didn't have a choice. The terms were presented to me and I wasn't allowed to change them. I needed the financial settlement because I'd lost my job due to discrimination, so I felt I had to sign.
Signing it caused me mental health issues and made me feel like I didn't matter. I struggled starting new employment as I have to lie a lot about the past employer.
Having to sign an NDA was the first time I felt helpless, hopeless, and powerless. It was a feeling worse for me than the 1.5 years of sexual harassment I endured from my employer. I lost my job, I lost my voice, I became jaded and distrustful of all people in positions of power.
Universities that use NDAs to silence victims of sexual harassment only care about protecting their reputation and assets. He was the dean and is still a tenured professor. Most importantly, I learned that I don't matter.
I felt silenced, disempowered, and swept under the rug by the first NDA I signed. When I chose voice and refused to sign an NDA in the second situation, it meant further public attacks on my credibility. The confidentiality agreement still hangs over my head as a threat. NDAs are still seen as normal trade-off by lawyers.
I am a survivor of childhood physical and sexual abuse. After running away at 14 and not returning, I lived my life alone. Everyone knows about the abuse. It was only me who did not agree to forget about it. I'm not allowing this to go quietly into the archives. Canadian law is going to have to fix this one. My case is still before the courts. I would love to be the first person released from the NDA in Canada.
All right, I'm going to hand it over to Christina.
Yeah, so hi everyone. So it's really important to note because oftentimes this comes up in conversations I'm having with survivors and individuals being asked to sign or who have signed an NDA. And a lot of places don't realize how these NDAs are being used and how they're covering up workplace situations involving abuse, violence, bullying, and racism. And, you know, the silencing victims is also creating a continuum of violence. So the work that I've been doing over the years is really trying to bring attention to how continuums of violence are showing up in workplaces. And when we look at non-disclosure agreements and individuals for survivors and victims who have been impacted by different forms of violence, bullying, and harassment, oftentimes individuals, even when they're with their lawyers, including with their unions, the power dynamics at play, and because of the trauma impacts, individuals are feeling the pressure of signing a non-disclosure agreement. And when that is taking place, too often we hear individuals saying through this campaign, well, why did they sign? They had a choice. And when we're looking at what's taking place around, what's taking place in workplaces and the power dynamics at play and the intersecting privileges that employers have in powerful institutions and organizations and workplaces, and also the power dynamics with the structures of the organization. So if you're an employee versus a manager, versus an individual that is according to the organizational hierarchy in a position of less power, it's putting individuals in vulnerable situations, making decisions about signing an NDA under the coercive nature of workplace conditions. And too often when individuals are speaking up about workplace harassment, bullying, and sexual violence, they become a liability. And they become a liability and with speaking up. And when we look at the reputation of organizations and institutions, this is they're deliberately using non-disclosure agreements to protect their reputation and to protect perpetrators, allowing a continuum of violence. So I can't, there's not enough time today to go into the full scope of this issue, but the silencing of victims and survivors is allowing a continuum of violence to take place in workplaces. And that's why this campaign is so important and why we need to continue to push for legislative changes. Go ahead there, Liz.
Yeah. I mean, Christina can talk to it from her perspective, but I can also speak to it from my own experience as someone that has tried to report. I am very fortunate. I think we often talk about there's so much privilege in being able to say no, right? Christina's talked about that. People are in very dire financial situations. The majority of people who are involved in our campaign, I would acknowledge, are primarily white women coming from organizations or institutions where they have master's level or higher level education backgrounds, socioeconomic status, privilege, etc. So we are very fortunate to be able to speak out. But when we do look at the data, and we can certainly send that as a follow-up as well, we have an NDA fact sheet. Marginalized communities, women, especially racialized communities and racialized women, particularly Black women, are disproportionately impacted by signing NDAs as well. And I think that has to be acknowledged. I think when we also look at the therapeutic process, that when somebody cannot talk, how do you move forward or move past trauma? So I think if we're saying that we are working towards trauma-informed, safe workplaces where we want people to be themselves and to be able to fully bring themselves and be present at work, then we have to acknowledge that NDAs and even non-disparagement clauses, which are a whole other conversation, are certainly an inhibitor of that. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, Christina.
Yeah, just around the psychological impacts. And, when we're looking at healing, so in the work I do as a therapist, as a trauma therapist, doing eye movement desensitization reprocessing work, when working with survivors that are tied into non-disclosure agreements, it's so hard for the individual to move on past the workplace situation. So if it was a sexual assault, sexual harassment, bullying that took place, when there's an NDA in place, when they cannot speak about that, they cannot warn others. And that burden that individuals are carrying, and it's happening far too often, they're carrying that burden and guilt around not being able to share with others in their workplaces, with their colleagues, about what has taken place. And again, they feel that they're complicit in the issue. And this again is, such a difficult thing to be able to heal from. So again, when we're looking at non-disclosure agreements, they're set up to silo, right? They're set up to silence individuals. And we know that silencing violence, abuse, harassment, and bullying actually creates situations where that behavior, those actions, that violence continues. But then when you look at the victim and survivor that has been impacted, the burden they're continuing to carry each and every day around feeling responsible, who's going to be the next victim, right? That is a lot for a person to carry. And I'm going to say, when you look at betrayal trauma in regards to what's taking place in workplaces, think about being an employee and going to your employer, your manager, reporting a sexual assault or sexual harassment that has taken place. Then think about, if you're a unionized employee and your union has then become involved in that, the betrayal of the silencing, the portrayal of the places, the people that were supposed to protect you, to look out for you, to look out for your wellness in the workplace, is then met with just continuing that betrayal and those secondary traumas, those secondary assaults that people are experiencing. The betrayal trauma is oftentimes what people really can't heal from, because they're continuing to be exposed to that environment and the conditions in which these NDAs continue to exist in, and they're not getting the protection, and they're feeling responsible.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a few questions, but we'll just wrap up a few statistics and some other data, and then we can dive into the Q&A. Is that okay with you, Christina?
Absolutely.
Okay. So how pervasive are NDAs? We have Dr. McFarlane is what she likes to refer to herself. She's a self-professed data geek. So we've been collecting data for quite a while now, both through our website and through our partners in the UK. Speak Up Revolution collects data at a global level. You can certainly check that out on the website. We also have a lot of data from the United States. But what we do know is 95% of complaints that are made in the workplace are generally settled. About 90% of those complaints contain NDAs of some form. Every single sector and every single employer uses them. I don't think at this point we have found an employment area of work or a sector or a union or anything really where people aren't using NDAs. And that's part of our point as a campaign, is that this isn't about pointing fingers and saying who's doing what and who's bad and who's good. It's just about changing the system. This is a systemic problem. It's pervasive and it needs to change. It's very commonplace. And most of the time, most people don't even realize what harm they're doing, because literally no one's been able to talk about it for such a long time. Practical consequences. I think Christina's talked about a number of these, but I'll just put them out there. I don't know if you want to add to any of these. Permanently silencing victims obviously being problematic. We know, it's been a few years, but Hockey Canada is such a great example, not great, prolific example of where perpetuating abusive or criminal behavior continues on. And that's just one that went public and in a massive way. But I mean, for that one story, there are thousands of those across the country. Stops others from coming forward, like Christina talked about. It allows people to continue their abuse in the workplace or wherever they are. And it contributes to other abusive workplace climates. I think we should also note, we're obviously talking about workplaces today, but churches have been prolific users of NDAs, residential schools, you name it, jails, the prison system. We're finding NDAs everywhere. Anything in anywhere, hospitals, healthcare. Think of it, and there's probably been someone that signed an NDA related to abuse. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, Christina, but no.
No, I think I'm good. Yep.
Just in case you want to know what an NDA looks like, this is the one that I found within the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. So just this is one variation on, it can look, there's so many different variations. But so the complainant and the respondent, the complainant being me, and the respondent being the person that I filed the complaint against or the company, understand and agree that the fact of the settlement and the terms of it are private matters, and that both parties will not communicate directly or indirectly, personally through any agent, i.e. a third party, or a counselor, or a therapist, or etc., the terms of the settlement, except to receive legal, financial, or taxation advice from a qualified professional. So while this looks very jargony, what you can notice in here, it does not say I can talk to a doctor. It does not say I can talk to a therapist. It doesn't say I can talk to my family. There's no exclusions. So this is our own Human Rights Commission here in Nova Scotia. They have claimed to have made some adjustments. We're waiting to see what those might look like and have a conversation with them. But still, at this point, you can see how I basically would be locked into never being able to talk about what happened to me in the terms of my agreement, which is why I was fortunate to be able to say no, only because I knew what I was looking for. So our model bill, we do have a bill that we're trying to table here in Nova Scotia. We have proposed it also in New Brunswick and across the country and also at a federal level. The bill will ensure victims are not forced or coerced to sign NDAs in cases of abuse, harassment, assault, and discrimination. It ensures that misconduct can be reported to regulatory bodies, which right now some NDAs are basically implying within them that you cannot report a psychiatrist, a doctor, a dentist, a psychologist, whatever, to their regulatory bodies, police officers, whatever you want to say. We also have some NDAs that have implied inside of them that you cannot report a crime, which is illegal, but they are in there, and people that don't know better are signing them and thinking they cannot talk to the police. And it allows for an informed choice, i.e. legal counsel, which, I take with a grain of salt because most lawyers are still telling people to sign something with an NDA in it. So my preference is they understand what an NDA would do for them for a lifetime. So what's next? We are working on candidate questions because we are looking at an entire avalanche of elections coming across the country and provincially and municipally right now. We're going to post those on our website in the next day or two, so people can ask candidates questions around their stance on non-disclosure agreements. We're going to be going back to the Hill in Ottawa to have meetings with Labor to try and pass legislation at a federal level before whatever happens now that the NDP's decided to pull the plug on their confidence and supply agreement. Dr. McFarland is making a trip here from September 21st to the 26th or 27th. We do have a public event happening in Halifax and some training. Christina will be doing training. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little tiny bit, but the trauma-informed training that you're doing.
Yeah, so there's training that we started rolling out in February of this year. I'm encouraging anyone on this, call today to look into that. We have virtual training options. We're doing some in-person training here in Nova Scotia as well. But I think it's really important, again, from community consultations I've been doing with different leaders and different organizations across the country. A lot of individuals really don't realize how NDAs are being used in this way. So again, public education, raising awareness is a huge part of this. Another huge part of this is including, if there's unionized members on this call today, really, taking this back to your unions. How are your unions dealing with complaints? How are your unions dealing with settlements, arbitrations, mediations? Also, I want to highlight, and in my work around sexual violence and sexual assault, Too often, the occupational health and safety legislation is not being used, which there is protection in Nova Scotia. And I know every province is different, but when we look around sexual violence, sexual assault, a lot of these issues that are coming up should be going down that path or going to the police if a survivor victim wants to move forward in that way. And too often, because of the unions and the employer, people are not aware of the processes and they're being asked to sign these NDAs, which is preventing them. And because of what's being shared by powerful people, lawyers, and the employer, too often individuals then fear actually reporting to regulatory bodies, actually reporting to the police. So I encourage you all to look at those trainings coming up and to attend if this is something of interest or if this is something that is coming up in your workplaces.
Yeah, thank you. And then finally, just we're going to provide questions, but we also have templates of all kinds of content on our website. You can write or call your MLA. You can certainly ask them questions about this. We would love to see New Brunswick join the provinces who have tabled legislation in regards to it. Our model bill is available. The content is available on our website. If you work at a university, we have a university pledge. We also have a organizational pledge where it's pledging not to use NDAs in the cases of abuse and assault, harassment, or discrimination until legislation is passed across Canada. You can share our content on social media. And also, yeah, as Christina mentioned, we're always happy to present and talk about what we're learning as we go along, and really sharing that information. You're not that far. Happy to come drive up and join you on a day and be there in person. And Christina is a fabulous facilitator. So, and we continue to look for resources. I'm a fundraiser, so I'd be reluctant if I didn't mention that we were quite primarily self-funded by Julie and Zelda for a long time. We've been fortunate to receive funds from the McConnell Foundation. We continue to apply for grants and funding. If you have any resources that you can share with us that we can expand our reach into New Brunswick and other provinces, we'd be happy to do that. So, but at this point, very grassroots, very volunteer run. And that's really the gist of what we're doing here in the province. And then at this point, I can dive into the Q&A. I don't know if we're supposed to answer those ourselves or if you want us to just go ahead. I can see the questions in there. I'm happy to sort of answer them.
Sure. Thank you both so much. We do have a number of questions, and also we're noticing that like a lot of people are chiming in to share, personal feelings and personal examples of having to contend with NDAs. This is clearly an issue that is really kind of very close to some people's experiences and to their hearts. So we're really thankful that you've brought this topic to Respectful Workplace Week and given people a place to actually talk about the practicalities of maybe what could be done next for policy change. One person here is asking, I would like your perspective on the use of NDAs in whistleblower cases, especially when harassment is a factor. They said that they're aware of a whistleblower who filed a formal complaint that was then terminated in an act of reprisal and was forced to sign an NDA.
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to jump in?
Go ahead, Liz.
Okay. Yeah. So I would just say this is incredibly common, unfortunately, and super problematic. I would just say this. I did not sign an NDA, but I have moved jobs. If you were to look me up on LinkedIn, it looks like I've job hopped quite a bit in the last 5-6 years. And then now I'm a consultant. So speaking out publicly in regards and whistleblowing around harassment, abuse, or assault, discrimination in the workplace has almost always problematic for the person who does it. It comes with very real consequences. Reprisal is definitely one of those things. I was fortunate to be able to leave the places that I was at before because they all took donations from the individual that I had filed a complaint about and that I had warned them was a prolific harasser and abuser of young women. But most people are not able to do that. If you're a janitor, if you're a cleaner, if you are working in sort of a low wage job, like we often say, NDAs, what kind of intellectual property could you possibly be protecting if you're making someone who's a cleaner at Walmart signing an NDA because they filed a harassment complaint against their manager? What are you like, what on earth are they protecting? We know that this is covering up bad behavior. Um, the individual that you're talking about, I'm very sorry to hear that. I mean, the other part of the problem is often lawyers will tell people it's just better for you to sign this to take the settlement and to walk away than to try and fight it. And I mean, there's certainly that can be the case. I think for those of us who are compelled to tell our stories and to try and, as Christina mentioned, prevent other people from experiencing the same abuse we have, the feeling that you have let people down and you're leaving them in harm's way is completely isolating, mentally and emotionally draining, psychologically damaging. That's why we try to provide the portal. We provide the opportunity for people to provide their anonymous testimonials. And we are still trying to work our way through how do we connect people through some kind of peer support. We don't know yet. We haven't been able to figure that out. But if that does happen, we'll make sure that we, send that message out as far as we can. More often than not, but like all incidents, the only real way for you to get some sense of understanding is to talk to others who are going through something similar. The challenges with NDAs and the real reason why they're used is that it prevents us from talking to one another so that we cannot identify a pattern of bad behavior. So it's a catch-22. I don't know, Christine, if you want to add anything. And I'm afraid that's not a very satisfying answer, but
I'm just going to say whistleblowing, if you have an NDA, speaking up about what it's, in my experience in working with survivors, it's always met with retaliation. It's met with risk. And again, usually ended up, individuals ending up being terminated for speaking up. Yeah.
Yeah. It comes with huge risk, and the contractual part of this is what they like to get you into, right? You've signed a contract and they're saying that you knowingly have agreed to never talking about this. Unfortunately, knowledgeable consent, as we know, is not always there when you're at the table under pressure. So yeah, that's why I think one of the individuals in the video says it's a lot like sexual assault. It feels like you've been violated all over again.
Right. Yeah, there's a couple of questions in here that kind of get into the realm of potentially weeding into legal advice, which clearly is not something that we can give. But just to circle back to some of the stuff that you brought up in your presentation and that just came up in your answer, is that when somebody whistleblows or violates an NDA, let's say in the example that you brought up earlier, where you said it's illegal to have a clause in a contract that says you can't report a crime. But from a practical perspective, what does that look like? If you signed a contract and that's illegal, my understanding basically means that, a court probably wouldn't hold you to it. But in your experience, what does that look like for people?
Well, Christina's just dealing with this right now, so timely question. Yeah.
I'm going to say this, that, legally speaking, it wouldn't hold up. However, again, people, right, for so many reasons, because of what's been shared with them and the power dynamics at play, right, and being told, again, if you have your union and you have the employer and their lawyers continuing to share false information with you. Again, when you think about a person that has gone through trauma and continuing through these injustices with going through a process, even when people are connected with the campaign, even when they're connected with informed counselors, therapists, social workers about the issue, is that it still prevents people from moving forward. So, if if a person did report to the police, it's not going to hold up. But this is the thing, that because of that fear and the power dynamics at play, it's preventing people from pursuing other avenues, because what is shared to people in a dysregulated place who have experienced trauma.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I would say the risk mitigation. I also always just try and advise people that the path that one person takes is not going to be the healing path for everyone. And there is no shame in signing an NDA and walking away. That is also an absolutely reasonable, logical, safe, sometimes trauma-informed response for you to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. People shouldn't feel shame if that's the choice they have to make. So
Mhm. So this is borderline legal advice, so maybe we can
yeah,
discuss what that means and what it looks like. But I see two questions here that kind of get to the issue of not having signed an NDA. So somebody who says, I never signed an NDA, but I've been threatened with being fired for talking about incidents with a racist coworker. Am I allowed to talk about it? And another person who says that they were the victim reporting an incident, um, and they were informed that they were under kind of what they describe as a gag order and was told not to talk to anybody. But both of these folks have kind of indicated that they haven't signed anything. So have you encountered issues like that in your work?
yeah. Well, I'll just mention this. You likely have signed an NDA or some kind of clause in your employment agreement. So I would go and check that. So that's one of the places where they catch us, right? When we first start employment, is that there's some kind of non-disparagement, non-disclosure agreement within your employment agreement, which is maybe what they're referring to. That said, if you were talking to an employment lawyer, they would probably tell you when it comes to cases of discrimination, abuse, or assault, harassment, that probably there is some kind of um, abusive power being used where they're using that as some kind of a line. That being said, until it's regulated, I don't really know. I can't give legal advice. You'd have to speak to a lawyer about that. I'm not a lawyer. But I would say to you, check your employment agreement for something similar to what I showed you in the PowerPoint presentation. It's probably there. That's one of the places they hide them, is in when we first sit down and sign in our employment agreement. I don't know, Christina, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think the employment agreement is such an important piece because, and revisiting that, going back and taking a look at that, because too often people don't realize that even before they've stepped into their workplace, that they have signed this, right? So it doesn't need to explicitly say an NDA. It could be confidentiality, privacy, right? So again, and as we continue to raise awareness on this campaign, I'm going to say employers, unions, and lawyers are getting very intentional in not explicitly saying an NDA, but using these other creative words to basically, which means the same thing. So that's language is really important in understanding that language and how this is continuing to create a problem with whether it's the employment contract, if it's an NDA or confidentiality, thing is being even before an investigation, right? This has happened in a lot of workplace situations when you're looking at different things happening. It can be occupational health and safety, it can be harassment and bullying. So individuals are signing them even before an investigation starts.
We do have a list, some examples of what those look like, and we have a list of questions that you can ask on the website as well. So certainly go check those resources out.
Oh,
Um,
fantastic. And maybe we
yeah,
can make sure that somebody on our tech end can drop a link to the Can't Buy My Silence website so people can access it easily.
absolutely. It's just can'tbuymysilence.com.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, and we also have all kinds of sample NDAs on there so you can see. I think anything where you're signing something that says that you are going to agree to keep things confidential, that has a very broad clause, that no specifics around intellectual property or workplace related materials, then you're probably signing a very broad NDA.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a thank you here from the audience for bringing this topic into kind of the real world where they've heard about it talked about on TV, but never
Yeah.
really heard about the practicalities of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another person observing that it's probably safe to assume that most government employees have signed an NDA of some kind because of the
Oh,
risk
yeah.
averse nature of
Yep.
that. Um, Another person sharing, a very personal experience having signed an NDA and then breached it because they felt that there was a risk to others and to the public, but then were, pressured into signing a second NDA as a consequence. We have a question here from somebody who's saying that they feel that, lawyers can make money on advising people about, complex kinds of problems like NDA terms, and they want to know if it's worth getting legal advice or if they would be better off approaching their ex-employer themselves to rescind an NDA with something like the template letter.
Hmm. I don't know. I don't know, Christina, what your thoughts are. I mean, there's an industrial complex built around this entire issue, right? We have lawyers making millions and millions of dollars a year on, and I say that with great love and affection because I know and respect a great deal number of lawyers, but a lot of them will admit if you're behind closed doors that this is a money-making venture for them. Protecting reputational damage. I can say that because my brother-in-law is a partner at a law firm here in Halifax. So, um, I would always defer to getting legal advice. Even if you're spending $400 to just sit down for an hour and have someone give you very frank advice, it's worth it. Just to know that you are getting the best advice possible with the current legal situation and the current laws in your province and your jurisdiction. Um, I know I understand the sentiment. I don't know, Christina, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I just want to say too, I think it's important too who you're seeking out for legal advice, because I'm going to say there's been a huge shift,
Yeah.
since I've even, come involved with this work over the last few years. There's been a shift in the legal community around this,
Yes.
right? So, however, there is a lot of lawyers that still are part of that status quo culture of this is how we do business. So I think it's really important who that person is that you're, reaching out to, and where they're positioned at with this issue.
I would just give two other things. One is that the Canadian Bar Association back in January of last year, 94% voted in favor of not using NDAs or advocating for a ban on the misuse of NDAs across Canada. So the bar associations are on board and have been supportive. That doesn't mean all the members actually participate. But yes, I think Christina's right. It really does depend. It depends on who you talk to. Also just really know that like your negotiation with a former employer or an employer, you are in a power dynamic. Also know that you are going into that conversation with an uneven power dynamic. That's how this all happened in the first place. But know that the culture is shifting. There is a dynamic change across Canada. You are on the right side of justice if you're advocating to be released from these kinds of abusive NDAs. And whether or not they do it now or if it's in 10, 15 years from now, things are going to change. And one day they won't be able to stop it. So my hope is that one day you'll be able to have your story back and your voice back. Now.
I'll just plug a few resources, one of them shamelessly. So the organization that's hosting Respectful Workplace Week this
Yes.
year, Public Legal Education and Information Service of New Brunswick, we're an organization that gives legal information to the public for free. So we can't give legal advice and we can't tell people what they should do about their situation or how to handle it, but we can help people navigate where to find information about the law and their legal rights or refer them to other agencies. So if you're ever unsure about whether what you need is legal information or legal advice, you can contact Please NB and at least just ask your question and see. We do often tell people that they should consider speaking with a lawyer, but that doesn't mean that there isn't information that can help you facilitate that conversation. And then also sexual violence. And I know that you folks, Liz and Christine, are based in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, there is Listens, the Legal Information Society of Nova Scotia, that does the same thing. Here in New Brunswick, Sexual Violence New Brunswick is actually currently undergoing a project where they provide what they're calling ILA Plus, Independent Legal Advice Plus,
Yep.
to any survivors of sexual violence. And their definition of sexual violence is very broad and includes things like sexual harassment. So if you're in one of the major centers like St. John, Moncton, or Fredericton, you can contact Sexual Violence New Brunswick and see if they can help set you up with some short-term legal advice from one of their volunteer lawyers who has been trained in trauma-informed principles.
That's great.
Yeah, they're doing great work. We have a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we simply won't get to all of them. I would love it. I saw, Liz, that you answered a question in the chat, but if you wouldn't mind sharing with all of the audience, somebody asked if we could address the issue of slap suits and how defamation lawsuits are kind of serving
Yes.
a similar purpose. And you shared a great resource, if you wouldn't mind just
Yeah. Mandy Gray is she's a researcher and a professor out of Trent University, and she is currently one of the people being sued by the professor out west, who is claiming that he was defamed. She's written a book all about it called Suing for Silence: Sexual Violence and Defamation Law. She's also doing a research project right now, if you reach out to her, where she's talking to people about why they're turning to civil suits. instead of going through human rights commissions and other complaints processes, because the system has failed people, and unfortunately people are now turning to civil lawsuits to hold their perpetrators accountable, myself included. So Mandy's great. Her book is very detailed. Julia's quoted in there. So that's a really great example of where defamation, SLAP stands for, I cannot remember the full title. It's essentially a way of stopping people from having public discourse around something where someone's reputation might be involved. So yeah, it's definitely there. That's definitely turning into a thing as well, which we but the thing is, I will just really quickly, and again, this is not legal advice. The bar for proving defamation and slander is much, much higher than if you sign something called a non-disparagement clause in your employment or your departure. Non-disparagement saying that you will never say anything disparaging about your employer. Cross non-disparagement clauses out of your anything that you have, because that essentially means if you say boo, anything bad about some former employer or person that you have this agreement with, that you're likely to have a lawsuit. The bar they have to prove that you are not telling the truth in a SLAP lawsuit, which is a very, very high bar. Again, it's not legal advice, but it's just check Mandy's book out. It is comprehensive. It is detailed. It goes through a lot, but non-disparagement clauses, we often call them the evil twin of NDAs. So, I'm sure if there's any lawyer on this phone call right now, they're probably like cringing, but it's the truth. I mean, where else in the world would you ever be able to say, you will never say anything bad about me ever for the rest of your life, no matter what. That's to me, that's just insanity. But anyways,
and for anybody in the meeting who isn't aware of what SLAP lawsuit means, we've just dropped it in the chat, a strategic litigation against public participation.
Thank you.
It means you're suing someone to keep them from participating in a public conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I brought up the term without defining the
No,
acronym. It's my fault.
I just want to mention too, Susan Holt, we did meet with her. So she has made a commitment that she will explore passing legislation should she be elected. We have not heard back from Premier Holt.
Great. Okay. So that was a question from somebody who asked if Blaine Higgs or Susan Holt have made a commitment to addressing NDAs. So
I said Premier Holt. Oops.
Premier Higgs. Yeah.
Premier
so it
Higgs.
Sounds like Susan Holt has met with you.
Yeah, she has. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. We're coming up on 3 o'clock and we do have another discussion panel
Of course.
scheduled. So lots of thank yous in the chat, people who are really grateful for this conversation. One person asking about signs that an employer is going to ask for an NDA. So you had mentioned that there was a checklist that people can kind of look for, or like red flags.
Yep, there's a whole comprehensive, detailed information on the website. And if you don't find what you're looking for, please feel free to email us and we'll get it for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And thank you everybody who shared their observations and personal experiences in the chat. This was clearly an issue that really spoke to people and has personally affected a lot of our attendees. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Christina and Liz, for sharing this really important topic. This was so valuable. As a note too, we've dropped a feedback survey in the chat. So if you have feedback on this session or in any of this other sessions that you've attended today, we'll have a longer feedback survey for the forum as a whole. But if you'd like session specific feedback, you can please fill out the survey that we've just dropped in the chat. And we'll be back at 3 p.m. with a discussion panel on decent work in the nonprofit sector. Thank you again so much, Liz and Christina. This was wonderful.
Lovely to meet you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.